Teachers deserve our focus. They're the ones who are defending science in the classroom every single day. It's a huge opportunity for impact. They need support. We need to learn, listen to teachers, ask them what they need. If you're not interested in doing outreach, don't. It's really hard and it requires a really wide set of skills to simplify complexity, weave in all of the social, emotional learning, active learning. If you don't have that, don't fake it because you're not going to be a good ambassador. Understand that it is very important. If somebody else does want to do those things, encourage them. There really aren't that many careers in science. Science communication is a path. It also produces transferable skills to many different jobs that rely on translating complexity to stakeholders.
Welcome, listeners, to the Science with Impact podcast. As you all know, the majority of us are research scientists looking to broaden our societal impacts. And we're joined today by Dr. Matt Wilkins. Why should our listeners, who are primarily research scientists looking to broaden their societal impact, listen to our conversation today?
Because I've been spending about the last 10 years trying to understand the limitations of our infrastructure for science communication. And I've been on this journey to connect with K-12. And I think it's a perspective you won't get anywhere else.
Would you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Hello, I'm Matt Wilkins. I am an evolutionary biologist who taught middle school for a few years and then started an education studio called Galactic Polymath, which I've been running for about 4.5 years now.
What are some of the disciplines that you yourself are a polymath of?
Well, being a biologist, I think inherently we work with really messy data. For my Ph.D. work on barn swallows, I was studying divergence of sexual signals. I had to learn a little bit about how to analyze color, to look at the colors of the birds. I had to learn how to record and analyze bird song to look at divergence in their song, as well as just basic capture and measuring morphology. We had to get into genetics. We had to do paternity testing to look at actual evolutionary fitness and how different appearances and behaviors affect the evolution of traits. We did field work around the world in 5 countries to collect a data set to analyze speciation at work and how these birds are diverging through sexual selection, through variation and mate choice and competition. So that's the science side, stats, data visuals, programming, all that stuff. And teaching, then also I've gotten into filmmaking. We've made over 50 plus videos to support learning and curriculum development. I'm into voice acting and also juggling. So yeah, a bunch of things.
And what got you into things like juggling and voice acting? How did these reveal themselves to you as interests over time?
I think that scientists in general are just curious people. And a lot of what attracts us to science is the same thing that attracts us to other things like music and art and photography. I think to be a scientist, you have to be a lifelong learner. You have to be open to change and trying new things and thinking out of the box. In some ways, I'm driven to entertain and make people laugh where I can. And so I like to accumulate party tricks.
Can you draw on any specific moments that really led to you becoming a scientist?
So my dad grew up really poor and worked on a dairy, and they just got moved around his whole childhood. Like he didn't have like a consistent network or family or friends. He didn't really have any mentors really. And somehow he was academically successful. He found his way into a career in business. It's not really where his interests lay. He just thought without any outside advice, business is where money is, and that's how I can support myself and create a future. He always subscribed to Scientific American. And from my earliest days, we would not be talking about Alabama football, but instead we'd be talking about like deep time, the Big Bang and evolution and stuff like that. My fate was kind of sealed from an early age, just being curious about that stuff because he was curious about it. And then I would just go to like our neighborhood pool and dig around in the pool filters. In the South, you get all kinds of fascinating things like lunar moths and stag beetles and praying mantises in there. And people were just dumping them out. And I'm like, can they look at that? And they're like, what? Sure, kid. And they were actually fascinated when I took an interest in it. And that kind of reinforced my interest further.
You've discussed with me before the need for scientists to do outreach beyond the lecture. I'm thinking about how you were introduced into science and thinking about how it connects to engagement beyond the classroom. Can you expand on some strategies or models that you've found particularly effective for integrating outreach as like a regular part of the research workflow?
My biggest thing is I think it can't be an afterthought. NSF is kind of unique among government departments because they've required this broader impacts thing since the 90s, and they've begun to ratchet it up. It's not going to salvage intellectual merit that's not rigorous in a grant proposal, but it can break a tie, and it can possibly even EQ up if there's like, and increasingly with the crunches on government funding, being able to break a tie is really important because individual scientists have written us into grants with pretty sizable money. The biggest thing is contributing real time and real money to it. It cannot be an afterthought. It needs to be just part of what we do, because if we don't give it the serious weight that it deserves, we find ourselves in a situation where we're living in a society that is antagonistic to science. We should be envisioning a science positive, a fully scientific literate society, not just that has a full diverse STEM workforce, but where every single person sees science as relevant and vital to their lives. And that type of society wants to fund science, is curious inherently about what you do. And I think it is in scientists' best interest to take this seriously and to think about, if we want to live in a science positive society, how do we get there? And it's not just through plugging into existing audiences. It's about knowledge mobilization. Think about outreach not as like a nice to have, but as a requirement. It's the final part of science. It is when you mobilize knowledge into action, into society. It's the mindset. It's the broader questions around your research.
What should we be doing that we're not doing? And what shouldn't we be doing that we are doing to build a science positive society?
I kind of lay this out a bit in a perspective that we wrote in Frontiers in Communication called Scaling the Will, Overcoming Barriers to STEM Knowledge Mobilization. This was a project that I'm really proud of, the collaboration that came together to pull this off. This is me, the second author, and the lead author, Stephanie Rapsiak. This is her first and only scientific paper. She is a veteran science teacher for over a decade, helping develop curriculum with us at Galactic Polymath, and now she's back in the classroom teaching high school science. Has a tremendous depth of knowledge about education and what it means to be a K-12 educator today. Carlos Scholar is an education researcher. The remaining three, Carlos, Jory, and Aram, are professors at North Carolina State. Carlos is an education researcher. Jory is an outreach expert, probably 30 years of experience. Eris, the Center for Advancing Research and Society. Mikkel who's a veteran science teacher for over a decade, helping develop curriculum with us at Galactic Polymath, and now she's back in the classroom teaching high school science. Has a anchor for this project, the biologist at NC State. We come from very different perspectives in terms of our understanding of the problem. I think this is why it's a really valuable perspective, because one of the things that we worked on first is what are the options for outreach, for communicating your science or trying to bring new people to the table. We developed this as a heuristic for understanding this in terms of knowledge mobilization. If we think of this as a roller coaster ride, you must be this STEM literate to take advantage of this outlet. And we think about it in terms of like me versus STEM. The highest barrier for a particular form of outreach or science communication to be effective, the biggest barrier is expert journals, like the one that I just wrote. This paper itself is kind of the most removed because most of the public doesn't. This one is open access, but a lot of science, as you know, is like paywalled, and it's just full of esoteric knowledge and terms that people can't understand. At the bottom, on the far left, is in terms of like the audience selectivity, there's no barrier to knowledge mobilization in the K-12 required classroom. This is the most critical audience for science communication. And it's also where we have the least ability to connect, because this is where you have people who see science and STEM as completely foreign to themselves. You have the greatest opportunity to increase that. If you can, over the course of their lifetime, move them from thinking STEM is foreign to part of that's a huge success. That's how we move forward to a more science literate society. The amount of impact you can have decreases as you go up that brick wall. We're probably speaking to a group right now of people who have some science identity, right? Have some strong STEM affiliation. It's less likely that somebody who doesn't see STEM as relevant to themselves will seek it out. You can serve different audiences that way, but the K-12 required classroom is essential for bringing new people to the table. This is kind of like thinking about the opportunities to connect with students. If we think of students as this critical audience, if we're STEM professionals on the outside of this puzzle, how do we get to students? We need to be able to disseminate it much more broadly to millions of students, ideally. And that always has to go through teachers as the critical conduit to their students, because they are the professionals. They're the ones assigning the grades, and they're the ones who understand their students and how to connect with them. So building collaborations with teachers is absolutely critical. And I think going to the concrete things, let's fill in this puzzle. The gray piece in the bottom left there, the scholar-teacher alliances, that is a complete vacancy right now. There once was a program called GK12. Some listeners may be familiar with the GRFP, the Graduate Research Fellowship through NSF, that it's a highly sought after, prestigious fellowship that means you don't have to teach for 3 years and you can pursue your research. There was an equivalent one, 12, that I think ended in 2011, that used to give the same level of funding for grad students or for PhD students to partner with teachers in their local district. And it was a phenomenal program that benefited at least 500,000 students, and it was just defunded. And when that funding came out, nothing replaced it. So there's currently basically no large scale training of scientists in how to connect with K-12, which really limit our ability to connect with teachers and therefore students, and therefore to mobilize knowledge into society. A veteran science teacher for over a decade, helping develop curriculum with us at Galactic Polymath, and now she's back in the classroom teaching high school science at scale. So you're left with giving one guest talk at one class one time a year, and that is just one drop in an ocean in terms of how much is needed. This is trying to put forward a large-scale vision for a systems approach to science communication, what is missing, and also what deserves our focus. And I would argue that teachers deserve our focus. They are the front lines. They're the ones who are defending science in the classroom every single day with usually at least 100 students. It's a huge opportunity for impact. We are bleeding science teachers. They need support. And in order to support them, you don't just go into their classroom and say, I'm going to do you a favor and give you a lecture. You don't just give some materials where you haven't looked at what standards they're teaching and what their scope and sequence is. We need to learn, listen to teachers, ask them what they need, make partnerships with professional societies, your state's science teaching association, connect with social studies teachers who may be trying to get away from rote memorization of the order of events, contextualize it, and how modern forensics and archaeology are connecting to social studies. They've been left behind with a push with STEM, and I think they're welcome partners for science outreach.
In terms of what we could be doing that maybe we're not doing enough, but definitely seems like we're not doing enough, is connecting our research to activities and explorations that can be facilitated by teachers. Is that a good summary of that?
I would say that's one aspect of it. And a big part of the motivation for starting Galactic Polymath was being at a school. There's a unique postdoc at Vanderbilt University that grew out of the GK12 program, and they actually found funding with the school district. It's a very unique situation. So Metro Nashville Public Schools actually pays for some Vanderbilt postdocs, which is a very unique thing. People just need to pursue them and see that possibility. So I was a postdoc at Vanderbilt, but I was a resident scientist at a middle school 5 days a week for 3.5 years. And it was one of the most meaningful things that I've ever done with my life. So basically I was in the building on tap for teachers. I worked with grades 5 through 8, ELA, math, art, social studies, even band, and obviously science. Teachers would just say, I'm thinking about a lesson about this. I want to bring in climate change in terms of increased flooding in Nashville that led to the 2010 flood. How can we have students doing a standards aligned activity that's based on real world problems that are touching their lives and their parents' lives? How do we do that? I was doing that on a 1-by-1 basis with different teachers. And I'm like, why can't I share this with a broader audience? We lack the infrastructure and the know-how to connect our expertise and scale it up, get it out there in a way that is easy for teachers to consume, that plugs into their workflow and their required standards that they have to teach. That requires deliberate effort and understanding and collaboration with teachers. to really understand how that works. A big frustration is just that as a community, I feel like we're often promoting our own channels all the time. So we can only get to a kind of a small micro audience. But if we promoted each other to each other's websites, we can grow our collective impact because we make it easier for people to find our stuff and raise each other up in the search index.
I'm on the Galactic Polymath website for those of you who are just listening, and we're exploring the website here.
You should be able to just look at our repository. We just released our 18th unit. A unit is like a lab hires us to translate their knowledge into a set of lessons, a learning experience that's intended to be modular, so it can just plug into an existing curriculum. It's meant to be easy to consume for teachers and modifiable to meet the needs of their students. And we also design multimedia to make it easy to teach for a non-expert. We create the learning experience that gets students active, engaged, moving around, talking. We co-design that with a set of videos that unlock the personalities, the perspectives and questions of the scientists, and also the technical pieces so that the teacher doesn't have to master that necessarily before they teach it. Our goal is that a non-expert can pick one of these up and teach it with 20 minutes of prep time.
Can you tell us what it costs for a research lab to plug into this resource and to work with y'all to translate their research into these kits?
Basically, multimedia is really difficult and expensive to produce. We tend to take on projects from like 10,000 to 50,000, depending on how many years of a project is. Some people get sticker shock from that, but my understanding is that there's no limit on broader impacts. And if you allocate 10% of the budget, that is appropriate. So obviously we tried to scale things based on the needs of the PI and their budget, but that kind of budget is what we should be spending on knowledge mobilization. And that's what it takes for an independent studio to take your work, do the due diligence. We work for impulses, like phases of development, to translate their work, design a set of activities. Sometimes we do novel analyses or syntheses to basically portray the data in a different way, create more readable maps and stuff like that. We built several apps along with this, as well as the videos. We basically built this from personal savings and one grant at a time. So I've never taken investment. And this was just a grassroots thing built with a lot of sweat equity from contractors and friendly web developers. It's been a long journey.
It's so well organized. You're able to find the information that you need so quickly. I love that. As a teacher, you need visuals for your presentation, and you need a way to bring the researchers' work and publications into it, and you want to know what standards it fits. And wow, I mean, this is just very well thought out.
It tells you how we teach the standard as well. So we don't just list them, we define to make it easier for the teacher to understand and defend this if they get any pushback from admin. This is the level of detail that we should be doing when we're supporting teachers, because we have a lot of first-time teachers. We have teachers who have been forced into teaching a new subject they've never taught before. And you have every year slates of legislation that complicate and politicize the sound science that they are actually required to teach. When I was starting out with Vanderbilt, I was working with a teacher who's a fifth grade science teacher. We were working on a project with frogs and amphibian declines, because when I was doing my PhD at the University of Colorado, there's several researchers there who study the chytrid fungus that grows on frogs and is responsible for huge amphibian die-offs in the last few decades. It's been said that like a third of all amphibians are threatened or with extinction. And that's something that not a lot of people know about. They are the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, because they need clean terrestrial and water environment. So we did this unit. It's trying to connect to how frogs can evolve and how natural selection for pathogens on the water, the land, basically how it all plays out. And so we're doing this rich lesson that's connected to current research, bringing new topics that are relevant to students' lives. I was talking about the lesson one day and I was like, I just used the word evolution. And she's like, are we allowed to say that? And I was like, what do you mean? She said, I think it's illegal here in Tennessee to say the word classroom. The idea that she did not feel secure using the word evolution. And I looked into it. And if you look up 2012 anti-evolution bill, there is on the books a law that Bill Haslam, who was the governor at the time, did not sign, but still passed into law. And it basically muddies the water around teaching alternatives to climate change and evolution. And this stuff is happening across the country all the time. And it's not enough for us to get upset when they start to pass this law. This is on the books. Teachers in Tennessee do not feel equipped, supported to teach evolution. So we need to have their backs if we want to live in a society where people understand evolution. Don't just throw your arms up and say, well, that stinks. The National Center for Science Education has been around for decades and is helping push back against these types of legislation, draw attention to them. I think one concrete thing we could do is partner with them more. The scientific organizations could be partnering with them, working with them to disseminate. They also train teachers around the country. So finding like-minded organizations, collaborating, and just co-promoting a lot more than we do currently, I would say, is a big stretch goal.
I'm hearing things like, don't be afraid to get political in terms of getting involved with legislation, voting, trying to partner with organizations that are looking to enrich young minds rather than limit what it is that they're allowed to hear of. That's what I'm hearing. Is that a good summary of that?
When we avoid controversy, we are effectively ceding ground. It's just a war of attrition against science. What we're seeing play out with Project 2025, it was a long-term strategy. And I think we've done a very poor job of forming a counter strategy and thinking long-term about knowledge mobilization, about audience building, about dissemination networks. And I think recognizing that science communication is part of the process and is fundamental for maintaining high engagement of the public science is essential for funding this whole thing. It's self-serving, so it needs to be part of your job. It cannot be something extra. So it needs to be part of tenure. It needs to be a serious part of the job title and the professional advancement.
So you're saying there should be incentives there because publish or perish is an incentive for better, for worse. For receiving funding, for receiving tenure, it is very much a large carrot and stick in academia for your progress as a researcher. Disseminating your knowledge beyond the classroom and in tangible ways, ideally with younger people in the world. I'm hearing a lot of that, and I think that's fantastic. Let's adopt the perspective of a researcher thinking about, okay, I have this lab to manage. I have service efforts where I'm serving on different committees. There's meetings and emails to be dealt with. I'm writing papers. I'm trying to get grant funding. There is no real incentive aside from broader societal impacts, which are a sub part of the National Science Foundation funding. And there's not really a whole lot of demand. There's not a lot of requirement that you participate in these sorts of things to continue receiving funding or to grow your career. If we made those an embedded expectation, it would be easier for scientists to do that. But until that happens, what do you suggest for the scientist who's listening to this being like, I don't have time to do all of these things and add this additional thing that isn't being incentivized or rewarded right now?
Part of it is like, where do those incentives come from? Where does money to run the institution? Having grants, as we know, through the Trump administration's effort to cut back indirects, bringing in grants brings in money to the university. Also, having really famous scientists helps recruit undergrads, perhaps, and grow prestige broadly. How can you actually bring these outreach roles into the formal advancement process and the carrots of academia? You could come up with ways, but it requires some time and thinking about it and effort. So until that happens, what do? I would say if you're not interested in doing outreach, don't. It's really hard and it requires a really wide set of skills to simplify complexity, weave in all of the social emotional learning, active learning. If you're doing science journalism, which is itself well-defined field, that's just a different skill set. All of it requires the aptitude and the energy and the creativity and the time. So if you don't have that, don't fake it because you're not going to be a good ambassador. But understand that it is very important. And if somebody else does want to do those things, encourage them. There really aren't that many careers in science. We've been overproducing PhDs for a long time. and not training them. A veteran science teacher for over a decade, helping develop curriculum with us at Galactic Polymath. And now she's back in the classroom teaching high school science. So science communication is a path. It also produces transferable skills to many different jobs that rely on translating complexity to stakeholders. If you're not interested, just recognize that it is an important thing. And if you want to encourage an ambassador for your lab, that's one way to support the broader goal.
What would that look like? You ask a graduate student or a postdoc to be the ambassador of the lab. Likely there will be one, at least one in your lab that's passionate about this sort of thing and is vibrant and wants to connect with people. How can you properly incentivize and compensate the additional effort that it takes to do a doctorate or a postdoc plus outreach?
Celebrate the little wins along the way and constantly evaluate your priority right now. Am I focusing most of my energy or anxiety around, is this helping me in my long-term goals? We're just so overwhelmed with things that demand our attention. We just constantly need to think about, obviously it's like mental health, work-life balance. So right now, while it's treated that way, I think there's a danger of overcommitment. If it is one of your priorities, you should not try to do it as an extra thing, but work it into your plan with your mentor. When I was a postdoc, I had some great mentorship. I started this science communication conference in Nebraska, and I was getting really excited about that and started a Nerd Night chapter, was doing monthly events. I just love this science communication thing. And they're like, well, you're not going to be happy as an academic because you're never going to have enough time to do that stuff. Maybe halfway through my first postdoc before I went to Vanderbilt, we had this conversation and it just changed everything. I'm just like, okay, well, now I'm going to do maybe 2/3 of my time explicitly doing scientific research. And the other time we've agreed, I'm just going to be pursuing my other goals in terms of science communication. So just having that understanding that like, it's not something I'm just going to do extra that adds to your stress. It's like part of my job.
Finding ways to bake it in, maybe through grant funding, maybe through initiatives. Communities are often looking for scientists to partner with to expand their reach and their connections to the research world.
And there are training programs. So there's the Trips Mass Media Fellowship that you can apply for that will get you a crash course in journalism. There's the Sci-Commerce program out of BU that I was part of an earlier iteration of that when it was kind of started at NPR, where they provide some mentorship if you want to get your feet wet, like writing for Scientific American or something. So there are opportunities for training in SciComm. There's unfortunately not much training in terms of how to serve K-12. And I hope that somebody steps up to the challenge there because that is a drastically needed area. Something equivalent to the Mass Media Fellowship that is focused on how do we serve teachers across this country.
What could that look like?
I have not been a mass media fellow, but I work with Stephanie Castillo, who went through that program, and several other people who've went through that. And basically, my understanding is you're kind of an intern for a summer or 6 weeks, and they just give you a crash course on the job, and you do some reporting, you do some investigation, you work with an editor to hone your craft, and then you've got some clips, you've got some publications on your resume that you can advance forwards from then on. So what does that look like for curriculum? I mean, that's kind of what I was trying to develop with Galactic Polymath is like infrastructure for that. And also the production value that we expect with a scientific article. It's like the due diligence with everything. But with the funding cuts, I might as well just say we are going to be putting it in hibernation mode at the end of the year. So GP is not going away completely, but it's going to be on the back burner for a while until funding improves for science in this country.
Given the challenges that science as a community and you specifically are facing with funding cuts, how can this scientific community that's listening and scientific communities more broader rally to support organizations like Galactic Polymath?
I would say that it's been very hard to find funding for this. We leveraged the broader impacts funding to build this thing. It was very bootstrapped. You need significantly more money in it. We just need to be more connected, reach out, form personal IRL relationships, as well as strategize about how can we knit our email newsletters together to go promote each other. How can we have regular meetings to just talk about what we're doing? I've started doing that with some folks at the National Center for Science Education and Data Nuggets, which is also facing funding challenges. Group to spin around translating science into accessible data literacy lessons for like 15 years. Now they've just had a huge grant cut and are struggling. So just building the infrastructure to disseminate knowledge and connect the scattershot approach that we have with SciComm 1.0 over the last, I would say, 10 years.
I imagine the next generation or wave of SciComm will likely involve the federal government seems to be disinvesting in SciComm. Our efforts into getting federal funding might be worthwhile. Might be worthwhile to find if we need to build infrastructure, that means that we need funding. It doesn't necessarily need to be government funding.
Right.
So how can we create value for broader society in a way that broader society can fund the growth of it? So developing a better money model and making this more of an industry-oriented project might be worthwhile.
The current president was reelected. I kind of saw the writing on the wall. And so like in January, I moved forward to build a new website. I worked with a marketing group out of Canada called Sunday Roast that are great. Part of that was trying to pivot to basically redesign the marketing copy on the webpage to appeal to folks who might be looking into either sustainable development goals of the UN or social responsibility. But then basically we just hit a rock wall. Nonprofits are struggling for funding for the same reasons we are. So we're all tied together. I think longer term, I have recognized that industry should want to fund this kind of knowledge mobilization. I've often said that Patagonia would be a dream client because they seem committed to the problem of microplastics and sustainability. I have one of their jackets that I've had for like 20 years and I've had it repaired twice by them. And they will repair it for the lifetime of it and they'll recycle it at the end of lifetime. And that's how everything should be. There should be like a sustainable cycle of consumption, but that requires a company to recognize the long-term benefit. And a lot of money is allocated to marketing, but those marketing budgets go towards your click-through rates and your conversion rates for a specific promotion. But what we're talking about is lifelong decision-making.
Even if it's just embedding our communities with the skill sets required to hear a marketing claim or a political perspective, become curious about it, deconstruct the data around it, and arrive at their own opinion as to how to vote and dedicate their funds. Even just that, I think, would be such a worthwhile goal. Whether that individual comes at any conclusion regarding anything that can become politicized is irrelevant. What I would love to see is just the capacity, this third grade average reading level in the United States, the issues that we're facing with the per capita spend that we spend on education, but the outcomes and results that we're getting instead. What I'm seeing with all of that is opportunities to improve our community's comprehension of science, reading, learning, mathematics, data visualization, to make them less culpable and less likely to being fooled by big industry partners who are attempting to manipulate one way or
Yeah.
another. It would just be so great to be able to have a populace of young people who can, more than where they're currently at, critically evaluate claims and data and arrive at their own conclusions. I don't know how you feel about that, but I guess that's where I stand on the whole issue.
I mean, 100%. It's become almost commonplace in teacher professional development workshops to talk about 21st century skills. They're kind of like, those are kind of going out of fashion, but like the 4 C's, communication, collaboration, and critical thinking. It doesn't fit into standardized testing as in a clear-cut way. It is connected to the nature of science and all this stuff, this factory model of education we've all leaned into and like trying to squeeze data out of these students, even though there's a lot of bad science that happens in the classroom. There's all these stuff that are sold to administrators and they, put them through too much testing too frequently. And actually the student's mood that particular day probably drives the score in many ways more than any significant change over a few weeks. So we're just trying to extract data where it's kind of in a irresponsible way. getting at the critical thinking. How do we get students to get curious about what's the business model of every product that I'm interacting with? What's the business model of Facebook? What's the business model of Google? I don't pay for it. If you're not paying for it and this is a wealthy company, you're the product. Understanding how I'm the product is essential. And the continued proliferation of all the AI tools. Why are there so many AI tools, many of which you don't pay for? Because you're the product. They're digesting your data in some way and they're using it for purposes that you may not support. How do we fit those types of lessons into the constraints of the shape of the current classroom in terms of like the standards that we have to teach? That's the journey I've been on for the last almost 10 years. Get more curious about the standards. It's a hodgepodge across the country. They're being revised periodically. And like, we need to have a say in what those standards are. We need to know what they are. What is the NGSS? The Next Generation Science Standards are the closest thing that we have to national science standards, but there's a patchwork of adoption. Many states like Tennessee and Minnesota have their own versions, and those two states in particular may have gone in different directions to be more progressive or more taking science and making evolution, like not using that word or stuff like that. But all that is to say, it's very complex. We need to understand that. And for example, if you want to teach about like viruses and vaccines, there's no standard about any of that. So you have to connect it to lessons about natural selection. It basically constrains the way that you would design a lesson. So it's important to understand that to support teachers and to support broader science literacy in the United States.
Understanding the mechanisms that teachers have to rely on based on their state or federal governmental requirements, and really just being aware of what the strengths and limitations of each of those are. You want your communities to be empowered to influence the education of their students within. You want your state to be empowered and you want your country to be empowered. But what happens when the power of one influences the other, limits? What I hear is really great is figuring out like what are the core competencies that we want our students to come out with. And then what we teach on top of those can vary. But we all want them to be able to graph data. We want them to be able to understand statistics. We want them to be able to read paragraphs and pull relevant information. Those are sort of the core pieces that underlie the science, and everything else that we map on top of that can be community, state, or federally. I'd like to invite Dr. Leonard Nardke into our conversation because this was our guest last week, and he had a really interesting question for you. So you let me know when you're ready to hear that question.
Sure.
My question is, what is the biggest challenge to translate complex mathematical concepts to early learners, young learners in the classroom? I would love to know that.
So I've mainly worked with middle school and up. So the earliest that I've worked with is fifth grade. And I mean, honestly, like I love working with fifth and sixth graders. I've taken a lot of the stuff that I was teaching in undergrad and just kind of repurposed it and taught it to them, like especially like evolutionary trees and stuff like that, or spreadsheets. Once you're like 11 or 12, your brain works pretty well. You digest stuff pretty quickly. And I think there's a huge difference between college and middle school that in some ways doesn't exist. I've done the same evolutionary challenges, like asking them to build a tree based on these clues, like a phylogenetic tree. And 11-year-olds are as good at that as 20-year-olds. It's because if you've never experienced something like that, some problems they don't have that much trouble with. If you're afraid of working with middle schoolers, I would encourage you to give it a try. Students sometimes they're like, why are we learning math in science class? And so like they've been sold this idea that subjects exist in silos. Some resistance to interdisciplinary teaching can come from the students as well as the teachers. So that has been a little bit of a challenge too. So if you're trying to do a rigorous math problem in science, it may not take off too well. So I've had to scale back some of the math for science sometimes.
So would you say one of the biggest challenges with this type of knowledge transfer is it's dissolving boundaries? So boundaries between what we think students can achieve at different age ranges and boundaries between subjects.
I love that. And that's really the encapsulation of the name Galactic Polymath, what I was trying to do with that. That's beautiful. Thanks for that.
You were recommended to us as a podcast guest by our next guest, Jocelyn Bosley. And as you know, she does a lot of work with what she calls fun-sized physics. I was wondering, could you provide us a question that we can ask on your behalf to her for the next episode?
Actually, Jocelyn and I met in the University of Nebraska many years ago, so very familiar with her work. And we worked on a project with fun size physics, our electric crystals unit. I would be very curious to know, what do you feel is the greatest impact that you've had through any of your projects? And what was the most fulfilling? And are they the same thing?
I love that. That's really great, Matt. Thank you so much.